Deputy Denise Mitchell, 30 seconds to introduce.
My question is to ask the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs her plans to increase capacity for the number of refuges providing services to victims of domestic violence. If she can outline the steps being taken to improve geographic access to these services, and if she will make a statement on the matter.
Okay, thank you, Deputy. TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, provides funding and coordination supports to 59 organizations that deliver a range of services to victims of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence throughout the country. In 2018, as part of the planning processes to develop services for victims of domestic violence, TUSLA began the process of reviewing emergency domestic violence accommodation provision in the Dublin region. And the findings of this review will inform decision-making with regard to the funding. It will also inform TUSLA's project to review specialist domestic violence accommodation nationally, which will be completed by the end of 2019. So importantly, it will also inform the estimates process for 2020. I am pleased to confirm that a new refuge is due to open in South Dublin by the end of Q3 2019, and this refuge will have 5 family units and accommodate 5 adults and up to 15 children. We do need to improve geographic access, Deputy. It is already difficult for women and children to leave the family home, but this becomes even more challenging when there is no safe place to go, which is within a reasonable distance. And this is also a key obligation to be met under the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, or the Istanbul Convention, which Ireland ratified on March 8th of this year. Currently, there are challenges for TUSLA in ensuring that we have the right number of refuge places in the right place for those who need them. But TUSLA will continue to work with service providers to plans for additional refuge developments where they are needed. Currently, 22 of the 59 organizations funded by TUSLA provide emergency refuge and emergency non-refuge accommodation to victims of domestic violence and their children, with a total of 155 family units of emergency accommodation. Of course, we're all aware of the detrimental effects that domestic violence has on victims of and their children, and that's why I have prioritized the development of these services.
Minister, thanks for your reply. Minister, there has been no increase in the number of spaces available in the last few years. On the 22nd of February 2018, you told the House that Ireland was exceeding the recommendation for the minimum refuge provision for domestic violence spaces because there was 155 family units comprising of 147 emergency refuge family units and 8 emergency non-refuge family units. You base that on the fact that you claim that the Council of Europe recommend 1 place per 10,000 women. Well, in fact, the Council of Europe recommends that the provision be, and I quote, set out at 1 place or family place per 7,500 of the population to 10,000 of the population. So on that basis, it would appear that our domestic violence refuge spaces are 70% less than the recommended amount. So in order to reach these European guidelines, we in fact would need 331 more spaces. So I want to know, Minister, do you accept these figures, and are we going to see any significant increase in capacity over the coming years?
Thank you, Deputy. I think it's, those are really important issues that you point out in terms of the calculation of your figures. I'd have to do them myself, but let's assume that you've done your maths right, and so effectively. But I think the most important thing that you're identifying there is that what are the guidelines that Ireland ought to follow in order to determine the number of refuge places that we have available. And indeed, as you indicate, we do have a Council of Europe document that indicates the minimum standards in order to help us identify what is the appropriate number. So that's the first thing, is in terms of what is the appropriate number. I think the Deputy may be aware that effectively that document offers 2 standards in relation to fulfilling our obligations under the Council of Europe document. One which is currently being followed, and the other which is what you've just commented on. I do think that it is worth, in light of your questions, but also my own ongoing interest in prioritizing of this, to look again at what is the most appropriate standard to follow in light of the evidence that's coming to bear on these issues.
Final supplementary.
But I think it's important that we note that this Council of Europe recommendation group, these recommendations were back in 1998. And it's 20 years on and we are still not reaching the targets. Now, I've asked before, and it seems very difficult and very hard to get answers in terms of how full these centres are to capacity, right? And I think this information is very, very important to us to understand, you know, the demand that's out there. So in terms of response I received recently to questions, for example, I just want to give you, Cork as a whole only has 5 domestic violence refuge spaces. Now, I think that's absolutely incredible, right? So but we have other counties, right, such as Carlow, Cavan, Laois, Leitrim, Monaghan, Offaly, Roscommon, where there's no places whatsoever. So in these counties that have no places, we're seeing mothers and children having to move to other counties to get services. So I don't think that's acceptable. So I would really hope going forward that we look at this. And just, if I can just say briefly, I know you made a comment there regarding the Rathmines Centre that's due to be open soon. But my understanding now that that's been taken over by the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive. So even though we have a problem in homelessness, I understand that, but it seems that we're taking from one to give to the other. And women who are fleeing domestic violence need specialist services, Minister.
Okay, thank you, Deputy. 3 things then. First of all, again, in relation to the amount of numbers that we ought to have according to the Council of Europe, the TUSLA is currently applying the standard of shelter space per 10,000 head of female population. There is another standard there, shelter space per 10,000 head of adult population. That's what you're arguing we should have instead, which means we need to increase. So what I'm saying to that is I think that we need to look at that again. Okay. The second thing is, though, I want to say is that there's a really important piece of research that TUSLA is conducting now in terms of, I suppose, where are the needs, working with the stakeholders and the service providers, going throughout the country, doing a national survey, et cetera, to try to determine, you know, where they ought to be. And you're right, there are 9 counties where we don't have domestic violence refuges. But there is important research going on. You just don't go out and say, okay, let's put them there in each of those counties. Instead, I think it's evidence-based, research is being done. Where should they be located, and also what kind of services ought to be provided? There are obviously different models. Your last point in relation to the Rathmines Refuge Shelter, it's a very, very important shelter for me. Some of my closest colleagues founded it many years ago. I have been there myself, and it will be opened. It's opened a little bit later than anticipated, but while they're waiting to sort out some other outstanding issues, not building issues, that the building has been offered for homeless people, some of whom are actually fleeing domestic violence. Thank you.